Hello and welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us from wherever you are and around the world. This is going to be the first in our three-part series, interviewing some former CEOs, discussing on the 2008 financial crisis and any parallels we can join today. And without further ado, I'll hand over straight to Andrea Hotter.
Hi, thanks Callum, that's great. Welcome everybody. I'm Andrea Hotter, who's the special correspondent for Fast Markets in New York. I'm really thrilled to be joined today by Tom Albanese, the former CEO of both Rio Tinto and then Vedanta, for the first, as Callum said, in a series of webinars looking at the 08-09 crisis and what lessons in managing those tough times might apply now. Tom's been in the mining industry for around 40 years or so. He headed up Rio Tinto for 6 years during that crisis from 2007 onwards, and then Vedanta for 3 years after that. So he had a bit of a ringside seat for the global financial crisis. He's presently on the boards of Franco-Nevada, a precious metals royalty and streaming company, and Nevada Copper, which owns a 100% stake in Pumpkin Hollow Copper Project in Nevada as well. And he's also an advisor to a number of other businesses. The only disclaimer I'm going to make on behalf of Tom is that he's speaking personally here and not for his former, any of his former employers. So the only other thing is we're not going to have a Q&A today because of time constraints, but I'm sure we're going to get through a lot in the next half hour or so. So Tom, welcome. Hi.
Hi, great. Good morning. Good to see you.
How are you doing?
Pretty good, thanks.
Good. Excellent stuff. So without, I think we'll just jump in straight in. Looking back in hindsight, there you are, you're at Rio Tinto, you're working away, and looking back and with the value and benefit of hindsight, were there any warning signs for the 08-09 crisis?
I think that with the benefit of hindsight, there's always quite clear clairvoyance in terms of what could have happened, what did happen. I think the difficulty we have for times like today is, we can even say the same thing, with the benefit of hindsight, where are we? But definitely there were signals in the market. Were they all properly assessed until the Lehman crisis? That's for historians to determine. But I can remember the Queen of England at one point going to the Bank of England and saying, why didn't you guys figure this out? Why didn't you? No one gets this. So you had basically a whole series of problems that culminated into a crisis very quickly. And it went from something that was in the newspaper to something that's affecting everyone's lives.
Right, exactly. So you mentioned the Lehman Brothers issue. It's September 15th, 2008, and Lehman Brothers files for bankruptcy. Talk me through that time. I mean, did the mining industry look like it was in trouble at that point?
I think that, again, each crisis is going to be different. They're going to be a completely different sort of way it starts and probably way it plays out. But I would say that it was really something that was seen first and foremost in the financial markets. There were fairly exotic financial instruments that were being discussed, and everyone was learning about these new acronyms very quickly. And at the time that the financial crisis was led by those financial markets, it was a leading indicator. I'd say the mining sector, it was probably more of a lagging indicator than a leading indicator. We were headquartered in the city of London at the time, and I can remember before our markets were beginning to hit very hard, basically the city of London just shut down. I can remember coming in one Monday morning, and from my office I could see about 14 buildings under construction, and in that day every single crane was stopped, and you had an idea that something bad was happening. We knew something bad was happening, but you got full sort of in your face sense of what the extent was. And it probably took about another month or two before it actually played into the physical market, certainly in our industry.
Right, exactly. I mean, so it didn't take long for those effects to be felt, and suddenly you had credit default swaps collapsing, the hedge funds were imploding, these, as you mentioned, complex derivatives were blowing up, banking stocks were collapsing, we were seeing crises everywhere. People were losing their homes and things. How were you thinking about that larger backdrop as you're sitting there with Rio Tinto at this point, you realize there's a problem. How did Rio fit into that? What kind of things do you start to do?
Well, I guess, again, every company and every industry goes through a different set. I think what happened in the financial crisis was that pretty much all sectors went down at the same time, and they went down quite quickly at the same time. So you didn't have the same winners and losers type of situation where you have today. So it was a case of everyone having to very quickly take some difficult decisions. we had distractions at the time. We had other things that were going on corporately that actually, we were also needing to focus on. But I would say it was about creating very quickly the resilience for whatever may lay ahead. So I think it was about bringing the teams together, bringing the executives together. And I think that's really what I really want to emphasize is that you have the executive, you have the executive team, but you also have an organization with tens of thousands of people that are also wondering what this means for their job, what this means for their role, what this means for family members who may have job losses. So from a CEO perspective, I think first and foremost, with everything else going on, you've got to get out there and communicate. You've got to as well as you can, encourage the organization to stay focused, not get distracted. So that actually they do their job, because if everyone in the organization stops doing their job because they're reading the newspaper or worrying about their own financial position, then actually you don't have the ability as an organization to react, respond, and be positioned. So I think that in many ways the CEO has to be a bit of a cheerleader and keep the teams motivated, keep the teams encouraged, keep the teams focused on what they need to do as part of the solution.
Right, a bit of a personalized approach to it then.
I think so, and of course that's harder now, because then you just get in a plane, and probably a lot more traveling in planes than CEOs are doing now. But you did have the ability to have that more up close and personal conversation.
Right, exactly. See, right now, you're in the middle of this major downturn. What kind of assessments are you making about how long it might last? Because obviously that's a very difficult crystal ball gazing question, but you're sitting there. What were you thinking at that point, that this was just going to be? What kind of a shape recovery did you expect?
Well, so Andrew, you were one of the lead correspondents in the mining sector at the time. You know that everyone was sort of second guessing, and you heard the term green shoots and V-shaped, U-shaped, L-shaped recoveries, and how long would it take? Would it take 2 years? Would it take 5 years? Would it ever recover? Some people were saying it would never recover. I remember this was an anecdote I have from that time. It was actually, I can't remember who I said it to, but it was around Valentine's Day of 2009. And I was asked what type of recovery was this? And I said, well, it's going to be a love-shaped recovery. And whoever I was talking with, their eyebrows, sort of perked up and said, what? I said, well, I think it's going to be an L-shaped recovery in Europe. It's going to be a U-shaped recovery in the US. It's going to be V-shaped in China. And so it was fit for the Valentine's Day spirit. But that's actually sort of how it played out. I think that even in China, that V-shaped recovery happened faster than anyone would have expected, because it was only about 2 quarters on from that, then you really started seeing the markets positively respond very quickly.
Something we're starting to see now as well, potentially as well. Do you think
that's the next question? And then is this another love-shaped type economy, or is it Lou? Is it just L's and U's? I think that's something that I'm sure there's 1,000 experts that have 2,000 opinions on, but we will have to be ready for whatever the recovery is, however it plays out. It's up to companies to actually create the resilience and the adaptability so they can navigate that.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the crisis. Now, what did that actually prompt you to do? What kinds of actions are you starting to take? It's 2008, 2009 is really biting. Everyone we saw had a big kind of push in a similar direction, but maybe you can talk us through that.
Well, I think that anyone that's had their career in a cyclical industry, and mining is a very cyclical industry, you sort of have a muscle memory of the things that when downturn hits, what are the things that happen the quickest. And unfortunately, it's always the case. The first thing to go is exploration. That's you stop thinking about what your portfolio looks like 5 or 10 years from now. You then think about how do we get through the next 90 days, that type of question. So some of the longer term investments like exploration, some of the R&D actually gets cut pretty quickly. I think the real no regret I had is that in all that we actually kept the automation going. In Australia, the mine of the future, and I think that was something that that was a benefit as we went forward. But pretty much everything else that had to do sort of with future thinking had to be basically taken out of the system. And then you have to go through the difficult process of determining how many of your operations actually should be running in this market, where they sit on the cost curve, what is the cost of shutdown, what is the cost of reopening, what are the other considerations that take place in that.
Talk me through that process a little bit. Talk me through that, because that's, you know, I always sit here and I wonder, when a mining company makes a cut, are they sitting there hoping that their peers are going to do it first and be the first mover and they don't have to cut? How do you make those decisions? What are you looking at? What kind of factors? You mentioned cost.
In the first instance, I think there's not really that much gaming theory involved where you're worried about what other people do. You look at your own operations. You look at the cost structure. You know, is it making cash? Is it not making cash? If it is making cash, you know, how can you basically, you know, keep the cost down so that it preserves itself in case things get worse. Right. But if it's not making cash flow, then you have to, you know, really think about what are your options. And you know, and obviously, you know, some operations you can move into care and maintenance pretty quickly. Other operations, you have like an aluminum smelter, a steel mill. These things are, you know, these have a huge amount of sort of inertia behind them. They have facilities that actually take a long time to cool down and heat back up and go through those very, very, very costly exercises. So they tend to be stickier in terms of bringing them, you know, out of capacity and bringing them back into capacity. I think at some point in time you say, okay, well, you know, then there's a bit of gaming theory. Who is the who's the first production to go to support the supply-demand picture in a lower demand? And again, I give Glencore was always a leader of that. I give them the credit. They always would have said, let's, you know, this is a market that we're all doing ourselves a disservice at that time. But I think for most part, it wasn't so much like you'd see in retail, like you see in some other industries where you're always worried about your competitors. Really, first and foremost, focusing on what your operations are actually doing. Are they sustainable in these kinds of markets or not?
So I assume within all of that as well, it obviously matters how diversified or what's in your portfolio, right? So, you know, I would assume there's an advantage to a certain extent to having more kind of gears and levers to pull with a broader portfolio.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and this may be where, you know, this time around may be different than it was 12 years ago, and that you know, when the financial crisis hit, you know, pretty much everything was hit. You know, you had pretty much all of the commodities were down. Now, if you had commodities that you were leader in that had low cost structure, you were resilient in that, but you didn't have what I call winners and losers. So, you know, sometimes the pure play operators would have had sort of the same type of look to them as the diversified players, where I think now it's this crisis is a bit different because you very clearly have some winners and losers. You know, people are not buying, not going to retail clothes stores or buying clothing, but they are buying toilet paper. You know, there is a shift in demand of different products, and for a diversified miner, I imagine they're looking at their portfolio and saying, well, this sector is lousy. What do we have to do? But we're actually being supported by some other sectors. So, you know, in this market, gold has been doing really well, for example, but so has iron ore. You would have thought that copper would have been a little more resilient. Maybe it is showing some resilience now, but you have other commodities that, like last time, you know, like aluminum have really tanked and will continue to tank.
Yeah, exactly.
And of course, now, which is different than what we had then, is that you have the coal industry, where, you know, the coal industry was seen as a baseload source of energy, which is no longer the mantra. It's actually it's reverse mantra right now. Right. And I think one of the questions people were going to be asking in this crisis is, what, you know, is coal going to get phased out quicker, or will there be other events imponderable which will say, well, we need that coal back up for a little longer, or maybe price pressures. In the U.S., for example, here, as oil gets curtailed and shut in, you might see less natural gas coming in. So you might actually see natural gas rising, and that giving coal some benefits. So I think this is still first chapter of a long book, I think, unfortunately, and this is going to play out. So in my mind, I think that you may see in this crisis more visible benefits of a diversified portfolio.
Right. Okay. Yeah, and coal interesting as well. You know, as we saw yesterday with the Norwegian oil fund deciding that coal was you know, tightening its restrictions and kicking out some of the big majors as well. So, you know, there will be those kinds of pressures too. So let's talk a little tiny bit about you know, there was a lot of talk after the crisis of 2008-9 about how the industry had let costs, productivity was low, costs got out of control, you know, capital expenditure was really high, the whole growth for growth's sake mantra. Maybe talk me through the lessons you learned from that. And do you think now that the mining industry has learned those lessons and to some extent has a tougher job of cutting and trimming costs and productivity?
Yeah, look, I think that there has been a steady improvement in efficiencies and productivity. I think that some of the cost pressures would have been where labor markets were tight, and that would have caused labor rates, particularly in places like Australia, to go very, very high. I think you're going to see some less of those kind of pressures on this side. I think back in 2008, China was probably more of a even more than today, a dynamic that was of importance, because China was still really at the earlier stages of its industrialization and urbanization. So the demand profile continued to look like that. And then of course the financial crisis hit, and it put it right down. But by mid 2009, it started again. So everyone was assuming, well, that the China story is still intact, and it's still continuing. So I think what the lesson from that period was that the volatility goes two ways. It actually can be extreme to the downside, but also is equally extreme to the upside. So for that 5-year period between about 2007 to the 2012 or so, you had a level of volatility up and down that we hadn't seen in previous cycles. That's I think on the upturn with that, as it went up like that, people probably did turn up the capital too fast. They did probably allow the costs to creep up too fast, and then that set the stage for a very difficult period up until this crisis, where basically volatility did begin to get subdued, but also you see pricing was less attractive from the miner's perspective than it would have been before that phase. And now I think what we have is you have equally prices are dropping down, and I think you will see in some markets that when people get enthusiasm back for what the future will bring, you see big moves upward too.
Right, exactly. So maybe there are some other differences and similarities we can talk about. Obviously the 2008 downturn was a financial crisis. This one is a pandemic, is a health crisis, but both have severely impacted the sector. Are there any other differences, similarities you can see? You're still involved in the mining industry very, heavily. So,
well, I think first of all, they're both crises of confidence. Whether it's a financial crisis or medical crisis, people just don't have confidence. They just they don't know what the future will bring. They don't know what their own personal situation will be. They don't know what the company situation will be. So you don't buy the new car. The business does not invest in a new factory. So until that confidence returns in one way or another, basically you don't see the non-policy drivers that actually bring things back. The governments in the meantime will turn up the taps and do what they need to do with fiscal and monetary stimulus to keep things going in that period. But it actually requires the individual, requires the company to actually have that confidence to come back. I think a financial crisis, basically the recovery is with financial means, and I think that's what you saw is that there were quite aggressive financial means. In England, the interest rates were dropped to the lowest in 300 years, and all sorts of sort of historic type benchmarks that were being set for that period. This is a medical crisis. This is a crisis of confidence, but it requires a technology solution. It requires some genius out there, and I hope there are a lot of them working on it that can come up with the necessary medicines or antibiotics or vaccines, et cetera, that make that work. And in the meantime, if there isn't a medical solution, it's going to be a social solution where people basically learn to live with it. You and I you're particularly in lockdown. I'm in somewhat lockdown here in New Jersey, but you're limited to what you can do. But at some point in time, they're going to be loosening that, and people are going to be more comfortable with the isolation that's required. But without a medical solution, it means that the response is going to be slower, and it's not going to be something that's just going to be, well, that's over with, because it's going to be something that's going to keep coming with us, whether you look at it waves or seasons or whatever. So these will all need to be considered in terms of probably a more prolonged period for an uptick, even in China, where I'm encouraged by the stimulus you're seeing, and they're going to be putting a lot more copper into their wiring systems and charging stations, which is all good for our markets. But I think you're already seeing that it just takes a few infections noticed somewhere, and then everything does clamp down again. And I think we're going to just have to get used to that world, and it's going to be one that from an executive perspective, is just going to keep being resilient, be ready for whatever the world throws with adaptability. and first and foremost, communicate. Just keep communicating to your teams. This is what we're going. This is what we're thinking about. This is what we're doing. This is what we're going forward. We're only going to be successful if every single person in the organization, stays focused and does their job.
In terms of automation as well, we touched on that earlier when you were talking about Pilbara, but obviously that can play a great role in the mine of the future in terms of social distancing.
Yeah. So I think, and because I've been involved with underground and surface operations, you'd see on the face of it, surface operations are easier to create that social distancing. But if you ever watch someone rebuild on one of those big trucks, you'll see that people have to sort of work close together with each other. So even in an open pit, you have social distancing issues. So I think that if anything, this is going to fast forward some of that technology development. I think I remember in 2008, people were referring to the mine of the future as Star Wars, with not as a compliment, but sort of derogatory nature. And I think that it's something that it's moved very quickly for something that one or two companies were doing to now that the bigger companies are doing. But it's going to be something that every company is going to be. It's going to be as ubiquitous and sort of uniform through the industry as you and I looking at a iPad or a computer.
Right.
So I think that there will be a fast forwarding of the technology automation shift in mining, but I think other sectors. I think we're in the United States, and we know that the issues around social isolation around meat packing and food processing is big an issue. Well, you've got to think someone's saying, well, we just need to sort of re-engineer these facilities, and it's going to be more automation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, that's one change that we think will happen. What about just from development of projects, things like that? Do you foresee any changes in the types of projects that go through going forward?
Well, these sort of, once in a generation crises that happen once every 10 years, it's hard to develop a mine or a new project that will take, 5 to even 20 years in some cases. So I think it just makes it that much harder for the new big projects to actually be able to be sustained over those periods of time.
Because of that uncertainty.
I think just that volatility and the fact that it's just hard to keep these running in that period. So I think that there's already been work over the past 10 years to you hear more and more about phasing operations rather than starting with the biggest thing that possibly can be envisioned. Starting smaller and then basically progressing it as you get more comfortable with the business. You show that you're building your teams and everything else. So my sense is that that whole trend toward phasing projects from a more modest start and then giving yourself time to develop it. Not only is it capital friendly, but I think it's actually more resilient in this market. I think also from an NGO perspective, because I think the resource nationalism, the NGO issues are much greater now. They're prime topic of conversation. I think that in many ways, if you start too big, you end up actually getting a higher level of NGO and civil society concern than if you start smaller. It's something that people are more comfortable with, and let it basically, as you're successful with it, let it continue to expand.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned stakeholders there. I'm just thinking back to a decade ago. We sort of saw the shareholder spring when they became incredibly vocal, and that hasn't finished. Do you think that will continue? What's it like dealing with the shareholder pressure, and I guess also the media pressure? Presumably, you've got to have pretty thick skin.
Well, yeah, I think you do have to have thick skin in both, and I think that it's always. I'm still smiling. So you have to be a bit of an optimist in this sector, and be able to look past the current or the next crisis. But I would say that from an investor perspective, the situation has continued to change and evolve. When 10 years ago, you had lots of specialist funds, you had specialist analysts that knew the mining industry inside and out.
Yeah.
And you had investors that said, I want to have certain part of my portfolio in mining, and that was all fine. And I think what's been moving, in addition to the shareholder spring, in addition to the capital concerns of the mining industry in general, you've had a large number of the investors moving from the specialists to the generalists. And you have a much greater place being played by the passive funds, the index-based funds. So you don't have what they call those deep experts like you had before in the industry. And I think what that has also meant is you've had less sort of industry specific capital that's been focused. So I think what it means is you'll see even more difficult in the next phase to see the access to the capital that some of the big projects will need.
Yeah, interesting. And in terms of, risks all about prioritizing resources towards low probability, high consequence events. Did 2008 prepare the mining industry, do you think, for what we're seeing now? I mean, obviously you couldn't predict it, but
yeah, I think probably for 15 years now I've been watching, looking at these event risk scenarios, right, which show high probability, high outcome. What are the big risks, and then you present it to the board, and there'll be different things. And I can't say that back then you had sort of the specificity of a global financial crisis. And the ones I've seen over the past couple of years, I can't say that I've seen any sort of professional risk analysis that, oh yeah, by the way, we're going to have a pandemic that's going to shut down the world for the next 90 days. Right. So I think that the risk analyses are good for giving a general direction and awareness, but they don't have the clairvoyance that you would like for these types of things.
Yeah. So just to finish off, Tom, if you had to give a piece of advice to a mining CEO today who's trying to handle the COVID-19 crisis, what would it be?
Well, the hardest part is you don't have the jet lag because you're not on the plane all the time. But even if you're stuck at home, you've just got to communicate. You've got to be there. You got to be as personalized as you can. You need to be on the screen like this. You need to be talking with the teams. You need to be engaging. This is all about communication. So there'll be resilience, awareness, 360 view the best you can, but just keep communicating.
Expect the unexpected. Yeah. Fantastic. Well, it's been great to chat to you. I'm going to hand back to Callum now, but thank you so much for your time and your insights.
Okay. Thanks. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrew and Tom. That was really thought-provoking. I just want to quickly share with the attendees that are still joining us the upcoming webinars. So obviously we'll be holding webinars every Thursday for the next few weeks. Next week will be Andrew will be interviewing Cynthia Carroll, the former CEO of Anglo American, and then Sven Rikard Brandteig from Norsk Hydro will be the week after. So we hope that you can join us for that. But once again, on behalf of Fast Markets, thank you very much, Tom, for joining us, and thank you very much, Andrea, and we wish you all the best.
Bye.